I've spent over 1,086 days mulling over this project, and they say good things come to those who wait, so today we're going to test that theory and probably test my patience a bit too. Over 3 years ago, I built a desk for my wife on the channel, and in the time since, I've contemplated building one for myself, but for one reason or another, I just never got around to it. And that isn't because there wasn't a need. In fact, the desk I've been using for years now is basically a sheet of plywood between two sawhorses. And as apropos as that sounds for a woodworker, it's just not ideal for actual work, but that's all about to change. So when considering my workspace, I wanted to approach it in a sensible way. Of course, I could build an overly designed special piece of furniture, or I could make something more practical and build a workhorse. No pun intended. In this particular case, I decided to go with the latter, not knowing when another opportunity would arise. So the first step in the desktop delight was to mill down my lumber. Now for the most part, these tree slices don't have much of a crook or bend, but for the ones that do, I joint the edge that makes the crook in the smiley face orientation. And that's because the sad face orientation tends to cause more of a taper, resulting in more material being removed, which in turn gives me a sad face. So, smiles all around. From there, I'll head over to the table saw to rip the board straight along the adjoining edge. As you can probably already tell, I'll be going with walnut for my desk. And here I'm working with mostly quarter sawn boards, which were a bit of a scavenger hunt to locate at the lumberyard. And that's because these boards are actually from a pile of plain sawn lumber that I meticulously picked through to find the grain orientation I wanted. Which, contrary to most opinions with regards to walnut boards anyway, is a straight, less curly grain pattern. I figure if it's going to be a desk that I sit at for the majority of my day, I better make it something I want to look at. So with the boards all ripped down, I could next lay out the grain orientation for my panels. Here I'm aiming to have the wider boards near the front of the desk and the thinner boards towards the back. I also like to flip the boards around so the grain flows smoothly between the transitions. Again, we're building furniture, not a gym floor. Once I have the orientation laid out, I like to take the sticks over to my workbench, then edge joint the boards. Now, over the years, I've built hundreds, if not thousands, of panels for projects. But I just recently started using a hand plane to edge joint my boards for panels, and I find that doing so creates an almost non-existent glue line. This isn't to say that you can't or shouldn't just use a joiner, or even just glue your boards right off the table saw. I think ultimately it comes down to your application and how you intend to use the panels. And that opinion is kind of a hot topic. But in this case, for a desktop, I think putting in the time and energy is well worth the effort. But at the end of the day, you just have to do what's most comfortable for you. I mean, as they say, life is short. So make sure you spend as much time as you can on the internet arguing with strangers. Wait, that can't be right. From there, it's on to getting these board faces aligned. Now, there are a few different ways to go about that, but I like to use dominoes. And if you don't own a domino, biscuits or dowels would work just fine. Since these boards are 1 1/16 inch thick, it isn't imperative that there even be dominoes. But in this case, I'm aiming to conserve as much of the thickness as possible, so here I will be going that route. The main thing to watch out for is that you mark out all your joinery inside the outermost dimension of your panel. There's nothing worse than cutting down your panel only to discover that you cut right through your domino and exposed it on the end. And it's also not a bad idea to stagger those markings. This way you don't accidentally glue your panel with the board out of place, which is a risk you run if you have all your joints in the same location across the panel. Now today I'm going to roll the dice and not heed my own advice, so this is one of those do as I say, not as I do kind of things. So next, I like to tap all those dominoes into the mortises. When it comes to panels, rarely do I feel the need to glue them in place, since these dominoes are more for alignment than they are for strengthening the joint. And if you don't feel completely confident, this would also be the time to do a test run on the glue up. Again, it would be pretty crappy if you got started assembling the panel only to find out that you skipped a mortise or veered off track with the domino. When it comes time for the real thing, what I like to do is glue up one board at a time, working my way from the top of the panel to the bottom. This way if I need to use a mallet to tap a board in place, I have room to do so. It also makes it so there isn't a bunch of glue exposed on the edges that will inevitably ruin your new shirt. Yeah, you're not alone, we all have that one glue up shirt. The next day I could head back into the shop and just use a glue scraper to remove any of the excess squeeze out. Now the sound of this thing being used is absolutely terrible, so I've turned it down so your ears don't bleed. You're welcome. Next, it was finally time to cut the panel down to its final length. So the first thing I'm going to do is just use my square to make sure that my track saw track is aligned correctly. And from there I can go ahead and make my initial cut. So my goal here is to stay as close as I can to that initial edge. And that's because I left all the checks and cracks from the drying process on these boards on the opposite side. Now, normally I would just chop all that down during the milling process, but my boards were just so close to the end length on this piece that I just opted to leave them long. I do have a plan to address any cracks that might make it into the final desktop, and I'll get to that in a second. Once I have the final length marked out, I can again use my square to set up my track. Here I like to reference off the same edge as my previous cut, this way I ensure at least 3 of my edges are perfectly square. And with that cut complete, I could move on to my butterfly keys or bow ties, tomato tomato. So the first thing I need to do is figure out how wide I want my butterfly to be. And there's no magical equation for figuring out the size for butterfly keys, it's more of a feel thing. So in this case I'll go with 2.5 by 1.25 inches. Once I have the final size figured out, I need to cut my stock down to the exact dimensions. From there I can lay out the actual butterfly. I'm going with 15 degrees for this one, but that isn't a rule by any means, it just feels right for this size key. If you can nail 12 degrees that would be ideal, but again, just do what feels right. From there I'll take my workpiece over to the bandsaw and trim it out. Now here it's important to keep your cut straight and cut as close to the line as you possibly can. You obviously don't want to cut into your workpiece, but you don't want to leave a ton of material to be removed later on either. So here I just take my time and work slowly. If I were making more than 2 or 3 of these, I'd go ahead and make a jig, but for one-off pieces like this one, I don't think that's necessary. With the shape trimmed out over at the bandsaw, I can head over to the workbench and grab a chisel to go ahead and smooth out those saw marks. This is why you want to keep that line as straight as possible in the previous step. If you do so, cleaning up the saw marks is pretty simple and straightforward. Here I'm not looking for things to be perfect as far as shape goes, but I do want my edges to be smooth and square. Once I have double checked with a double square to make sure that everything's correct, I can head back over to the desktop and attach my butterfly using some 2-sided tape. From there, I'll just use a combination of a marking knife and a mechanical pencil to mark out the outside edge of my key. This again is why I wasn't super concerned about the overall shape, because no matter what the shape is, when I trace it out here, it's going to align perfectly. The only thing you really have to watch out for is that when you pop the butterfly key in place, that it's oriented in the correct position. And that's because it's only going to fit in one way. So what I like to do is just trace along my entire key using a marking knife, and then use my mechanical pencil to reinforce that line. This makes things a lot easier to see when you're working with the router. Next I'll set up my router to the exact depth that I want the key to sit, which in this case is going to be 3/8 of an inch deep. Then from there, I'll just use a 1/4 inch router bit to hog out the majority of material. Here I like to use a downcut bit to ensure that the bottom of the mortise is nice and flat and there's less tear out near the edges. I'm just careful not to get too close to the edges of my marking line, because if I go over, it's going to be difficult to repair. Once I have the majority of material removed, I'll switch from my router to a chisel and square up and remove the remaining material. Throughout the process, I like to test fit the butterfly until I'm satisfied with the fit. I want the butterfly to be tight, but not so tight that it won't tap in place. It's more of that Goldilocks zone. It's also important that you don't tap it all the way home, because getting it back out isn't going to happen. Instead, you want just about 1/3 of the key in place, and then you can be pretty sure that you can full send it when the time comes. And I guess fortunately for us, that time is now. So what I'm going to do is apply a light layer of glue on the bottom of the mortise and a smidgen on the sides. From there, I'll just use a piece of scrap wood and a mallet to tap the butterfly in place. Once it's fully seated, I'll just use a combination of a hand plane and a random orbit sander to even up the inlay. Now this butterfly is actually going to live on the underside of my desk, and that's because I'm not a die-hard fan of butterfly keys, sometimes they're just necessary. But I'm really curious to know what you guys think about them, so let me know down in the comments. If you enjoy the look of a butterfly key, start your comment with keys. If not, start it with no keys. And as always, if you start your comment with keys or no keys, I'll reply to you first because I know you're paying attention. And yes, I do try to reply to every comment. So with my ripping blade installed at the table saw, it was time to go ahead and rip down the desktop to its final width. With a cut like this, you only get one shot, so it's worth taking whatever extra time you need to make sure that everything's set up correctly before going into it. Since the desktop is so long and heavy, I like to use a roller stand as well as a featherboard to make sure that things stay nice and straight during the cut. From there I could go ahead and hit the top and bottom with a random orbit sander, sanding up to about 150. I'm not trying to get a perfectly flat panel at this point, but I want to make sure things are relatively smooth. Later on I'll flatten the desktop back out with a hand plane, but for now I just want to try to get things nice and even. Next I'll use some black CA glue to fill in the crack on the top side. If this was any wider I'd probably go with epoxy, but at a 1/16 of an inch, CA glue should do just fine. So on my current desk setup, I do have a shelf that raises my monitor up a bit, and I wanted to keep that same aesthetic with this one. So next I'll use my table saw to rip that shelf panel down to its rough final width, and my crosscut sled to cut it down to its rough final length. The desktop as well as the shelf are going to have a smooth transition on the front edge, so I want to leave the width oversized by about a 1/16 of an inch. This way when I attach the templates later on, I'll have a little room in there to smooth out the curves. I think it's really tempting to go for your final dimensions right off the table saw, but I always try to leave a little extra material to be removed with a hand plane or sanding. This way there's space to remove any saw marks, plus you get the added benefit of being able to make sure your fit is perfect on all your parts. One other feature that I have on my current setup is a small laptop stand, but it's seen better days, so I figured while I have the CNC fired up, I'd go ahead and carve out a new one. And as a side note, if you want free templates for this stand, I'll leave them linked down in the description. It should fit most 12-inch and smaller laptops, but you may have to scale it up for larger models. This design just uses any 1/2-inch material and interlocks with a half-lap joint. Unfortunately, when it comes off the CNC, there's a little cleanup that needs to be done, but that can be quickly accomplished with a sharp chisel. And my apologies for hopping around. At my age, I'm just good at multitasking. I can listen, ignore, and forget all at once. So with my templates squared up and traced out, I could just use my jigsaw to roughly carve out the shape on my desktop. Since the shelf is smaller and more portable, I'll do that over at the bandsaw. And as you can probably already start to see, the desktop is a scaled up version of the shelf, or I guess the shelf is a scaled down version of the desktop. But while we're at the bandsaw, here's another bandsaw thought. Your shadow is a confirmation that light has traveled nearly 93 million miles unobstructed, only to be deprived of reaching the ground in the final few feet thanks to you. Wild. Unfortunately, there's not much you can do about that one. You can, however, control your ability to see new videos when they drop. So if you're not subscribed, take control and do so now. And if you're enjoying this video, give it a like. It really helps out, and I appreciate your support. So with my massive templating bit installed in the router and my templates attached, I can next route the pattern into my desk's edge. I really love using this bit for template routing, but it can be a bit intimidating, especially when it comes to handheld routing. If you're working with a large bit like this one, make sure you're taking no more than a 1/16 of an inch off your workpiece at one time. Any more than that, you're probably going to want to scale down to a smaller router bit. And if you're not comfortable with wielding such a massive cutter head, just take lighter passes with a smaller flush trim bit. You'll also want to slow your router speed control down when using larger bits. Otherwise, you'll likely get a lot of burning and your routing experience will be pretty squirrely, so make sure you follow the manufacturer's recommended speeds. Again, with the shelf being quite a bit smaller, I opted to do that at the router table. Anytime I can use a router table over a handheld router, I tend to do so just because it feels more controlled. A lot of things I do in the shop take confidence and time to get used to. So if you're just starting out, or even if you're not, if there's a step in the process that feels unsafe, try to consider other solutions. It's never worth risking getting hurt or losing a digit to build any woodworking project. So with my mortises laid out in the bottom of my shelf, I could go ahead and use a 1/2-inch upcut bit to route them in place. Now these mortises are pretty wide and probably could be separated into 2 mortises, but for this piece I just don't think that's necessary. Wood expands and contracts with seasonal movement, but the grain on the shelf and vertical supports is going to run in the same direction, which means that they will expand and contract together. I also think there's a little too much emphasis on expansion today. While wood does move, it's not quite to the extent that it needs to be considered for every single joint you make. I think it's more important when it comes to structural joinery. Over 12 inches, this quarter sawn walnut might move 3/64 of an inch, so as long as there's some space inside the mortises for that, the joints are going to be just fine. And now that I've stepped down from my soapbox, I can get back to cutting the shoulders for the tenons on the vertical supports. And I'll just do that at the table saw using a dado stack and a sacrificial fence. I like working my way from mortise to tenon. If I work the other way around and the tenon ends up too loose, there's not really any way to go back and tighten things up. But in the opposite scenario where my tenons are slightly too tight, I can just use a shoulder plane to work the fit. From there, I'll just head over to the bandsaw to cut in the edge cheek and shoulder. This is actually the exact same process I would use if I was creating stopped dados, so I guess it's only right to use a magnetic stop to stop for the stops. With the shoulders cut in, I'll just use a handsaw and some chisels to chop in the cheek. Just be careful in this scenario not to undercut that shoulder, because if you do, the edge of that shoulder is going to be lifted from the workpiece. To perfect that final fit and finish, I like to use a router plane in the bottom of the mortises. This just ensures that everything's nice and flat, and that there's a nice connection between the top of the tenon and the bottom of the mortise. And this one definitely came together a lot better than my son's PowerPoint presentation about why we should go to water parks. It had several slides. Next, it was time to move on to the base for this desk, which also happens to be the sponsor for today's video, FlexiSpot. I've owned a few different standing desk accessories over the years, but none have really worked out the way I wanted. That's where FlexiSpot really shines, because their E7 Plus standing desk includes a base that's fully adjustable and capable of holding over 440 pounds. It also includes height adjustments that are programmable, which allows for presetting a standing and sitting position. I also like that the desk features 4 legs, so stability will be a massive upgrade from my sawhorses. Now, if you don't want to make your own desktop like I have here, there are a bunch of different options and accessories to choose from. They even have a bunch of monitor mounts and monitor shelf options as well. And speaking of monitor shelves, let's hop back into attaching mine. So to hold my monitor shelf in place, I'm going to be using Festool Connectors. This will allow me to attach and remove the shelf as I want to in the future. Of course, I'll have to plug a few holes if I want to go without the shelf one day, but I figured that was better than permanently attaching it and wanting it removed later on. Now at this point I've used these connectors on quite a few different projects, and if you want to see a more in-depth video about how these work, check out the loft bed build from a few months ago. But in a nutshell, I would just describe these as IKEA furniture on steroids. Just not the ones that'll inflate your head like Barry. The connectors are incredibly strong and work really well for things like knockdown furniture. I've been finding all sorts of different ways to intertwine these into builds since I've gotten the system, and though that initial cost is kinda pricey, once you have them in the shop, they're super useful. Not to mention that after you use them a few times, the assembly becomes pretty quick. So after you plunge in the mortises, all you have to do is drop in the pre-assembled hardware and thread on a couple connectors. The only real hiccup I've had is dropping in the cam and locking it in place before I was actually ready. So when it does come time to pop in your cam hardware, just know that getting it back out after it's tightened down is pretty tricky. I've had some success using it all, but honestly you should just plan for it to stay forever once you pop it in place. So with the vertical supports locked into the tabletop, I could drop on the shelf and check the fit. Like a glove. Next it was time to get to work on the edge treatments. Now for the majority of the edges here, I'm going to be using a 1/4 inch roundover bit. And that's going to change a little bit when it comes to the front edge of the desk, but don't worry, we'll get to that momentarily. For now, I'm going to round over all the edges of the shelf, and then move on to rounding over the edges of the laptop stand. And for the laptop stand, I'm only going to do an 1/8 inch roundover because a 1/4 inch roundover would just remove too much material. So with the roundovers at the router table wrapped up, I can move on to the edge treatment on the desktop. And the first thing I'm going to do here is use a 90-degree edge sanding jig to remove all the router marks and saw marks. This is actually a new addition to the shop, and I gotta tell you that if you have an ETS 125 and build a lot of tables, you should really consider adding one to your collection. I've built a ton of tabletops, and getting the saw marks off the edges can be a real pain, as hand planes don't always give you the leverage you need, so if you're looking for a faster solution, check it out. So the next step was to go ahead and round over all the edges with the 1/4 inch roundover bit. And I'm going to go ahead and just do all the edges of the desktop at this point, and deal with that front edge transition next. As smooth as a 1/4 inch sounds, I just don't think that it's going to be very comfortable for my forearms to rest on that for a prolonged period of time. So instead I'm going to throw in a massive chamfer bit and carve in a more smooth transition. So once I have the ideal depth set, I'm going to make 2 marks on either side of the desk so I know when to start and stop my transition. Then from there I'll gradually get to my final depth by taking multiple passes. The only downside is that with a bit this large, the dust collection doesn't really work, so it makes quite the mess. This is also another one of those scenarios where you really have to watch your router speed. Because this bit has a 2-inch cut diameter, I have to move really slowly across the workpiece. Any quick movements or sudden jerks will dig the bit deep into the workpiece, and we definitely don't want that to happen. From there, I'll again use my sanding jig to go ahead and smooth out those router marks. In the areas where I started and stopped the cut, I want to smooth the transition by taking light passes with the edge guide. This will help to ease the forearm rest out of the corners. From there, I'll just get to work with the sanding block to smooth out those transitions a little more, and then bust out the number 7. And there's nothing quite like going at it with hand planes to make you feel old. Now, I'm not saying that I'm super old, I'm just saying that my dinner time and my bedtime are getting dangerously close together. Once I was happy with the flatness of the majority of the desktop, I could move from the number 7 over to the number 4 smoother to knock down any remaining high spots. I'm more than aware that not everyone is going to want to break out hand planes to flatten down a desktop. So for the non-hand tool woodworkers, you'll be happy to know that once I've finished my hand tool workout, I'll wrap things up by sanding the desk up to 180 grit. And if it so happens that hand tools aren't your thing, you could just skip that previous step altogether and jump right to this one. Things just may not be as flat as Kyrie likes his earth. From there, it was finally time to glue the shelf onto the vertical supports. And to do that, I'm going to attach the supports to the desktop and glue and clamp them in place. Whenever it's possible to glue parts in their final orientation, I think it's a good idea. This way you don't have to worry about parts shifting or drying out of square. Next, I can center the base on the underside and transfer the mounting hole locations onto the desktop. This again is why I really like the adjustability of this base, and FlexiSpot provides all kinds of standing desks to meet your demands. If you prefer a rock-solid stability standing desk, then the E7 Plus is your top choice. If you want a premium standing desk for daily use, you can check out their E7 or E7 Pro C-frame. And if you're limited on budget, you can choose their E5 model. Unlock more savings by using the exclusive promo code provided in the description. And click on the FlexiSpot link today to enjoy these fantastic discounts. So with my mounting locations marked out, I used a 5/64 drill bit to drive in my pilot holes. Another option might be to use threaded inserts, but I think for this desk that's overkill. Instead, I just opted to go with the provided hardware. Next, it was on to carving in my inlay for my brand. And that comes together pretty quickly with a template and a router bit. From there, I'll just scuff up the backside and then use a little CA glue to hold it in place. And finally, we're on to the finish. And the finish on this one is going to be Roubio Monocoat. It's been about 2 years since I covered how to apply Roubio, so here's a quick refresher. After my initial sanding up to 180 grit, I need to water pop the grain. This raises the grain so that when the finish is applied, we don't have fibers popping up and ruining that smooth finish. Once the surface is dry, I'll lightly sand everything again with some 180 grit. From there, I'll quickly vacuum all the parts and wipe everything down with some mineral spirits and a shop towel. Next, it's time to mix up the finish, and I'll use a 3:1 ratio of parts A and B. I really like to use Roubio Monocoat Pure because it brings out the natural color in the lumber without adding any dyes. And with the finish mixed, I'll apply the finish using a combination of a card spreader and a Scotch-Brite pad. So once the finish is soaked in for about 10 minutes, I wipe away any excess with a shop towel to avoid gumming up. Because Roubio is a hard wax oil, it'll be dry to the touch in about 24 hours and cure over the next 3 weeks. From there, maintenance is super easy, and if I need to repair the finish, I just have to sand it back and reapply. So while I wrap up the finish, let me take a quick moment to say thank you all for watching and for your support. It's not always easy to find time for these projects as I design, build, and edit them on nights and weekends. So if you enjoy the show and you want to support the channel, I'd like to invite you to join my Patreon. There you'll get discount codes, access to monthly plans, a Discord invite where we chat about tips and tricks pretty much all day, and a lot more you just can't get with YouTube alone. So if that sounds like something that would interest you, check out the link in the description. And as always, if you can't join today, no sweat. Thanks for watching, liking, and sharing. And a huge thank you to those of you who have already joined. Your donations go directly towards making these videos, so thank you. So the final step in this one is to attach the base and lock down a few dangling wires. Since all the holes were pre-drilled earlier, aligning and attaching the base is pretty uneventful. But now that it was all locked in place, I had to choose the location for the control switch and the power bank. Luckily, a few setup blocks made that super easy. From there, I could attach the cord management rack to the rear of the desk. I think the most challenging part was honestly trying to wrangle in any hanging cords. But with some patience and a few choice words, those were locked down in no time. And finally, I could take the base for a quick test run. And I gotta tell you, I was really impressed with how quiet the motors operated, as well as how smooth they functioned. Next, it was time to flip the desk upright and attach the shelf. Again, that just drops in place and is secured with a couple locking pins. From there, I could pop on the hole covers, and we're on to the glamour shots. So after 3+ years and about a week in the shop, I can finally lose the sawhorses and plywood. And I'd say that this desk is a pretty massive upgrade. From the smooth transition to the convenient lifting capabilities, this desk is sure to be a workhorse throughout all the daily ups and downs. I absolutely love the way the grain flows horizontally across the desktop and the way those hard lines are broken up with the subtle curves of the front edges. The shelf sits slightly forward from the rear of the desktop, which allows for the screen to fill my work area without forfeiting any additional desk space. So hopefully now I'll see my mistakes before they make it into the final design. But if you enjoyed this build and you want to see more, check out this video next. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and as always, I knew this would work, and I'll see you next time.